Title asterisk Why the greatest military mistake was made by choice. According to Thucydides, the moment the Athenian assembly voted for a million-man invasion of Sicily, the city-state was at the peak of its empire. The navy ruled the Aegean. Its silver was flowing from the silver mines of Laurium, and its name was spoken with reverence across the Mediterranean. Yet that same decision would become the single most disastrous strategic gamble any power has ever taken. The very fact that a democratic polis chose to overextend itself when the odds were stacked against it mirrors the boardrooms of today, where CEOs approve billion-dollar bets while the market trembles. You might think the mistake was simply a military blunder. In fact, Thucydides tells us the error began in the assembly, in the hearts and minds of the citizens, before any ships ever left the Piraeus. The lesson is timeless. When a great power lets hubris outweigh sober counsel, the empire it built can crumble as fast as a house of cards in a storm. Picture Athens in 415 BC. The city's walls gleam with marble, its hoplites drill in the agora, and the navy, 350 triremes, cuts the waves like a glittering steel forest. The Peloponnesian War has raged for 5 years. Sparta has been beaten at sea, and the plague that once felled the populace is finally abating. Across the sea, the island of Sicily is a prize beyond imagination. Fertile lands, abundant grain, and the wealthy cities of Syracuse and Gela at the heart of the western Mediterranean. The Athenians had already secured a foothold in the western islands, and the strategic calculations seemed simple. Grab Sicily, choke the supply lines of their enemies, and cement Athenian dominance from Greece to North Africa. But the decision was not made in a war room. It was made in the open air of the Athenian assembly, a place where any citizen could speak, where rhetoric reigned, and where the famed general Alcibiades, freshly returned from exile, stood today as the most persuasive politician the city had ever seen. He promised glory, he promised riches, he promised that the gods themselves would favor us. In contrast, Nicias, the seasoned commander who had previously led the disastrous and aborted expedition to Sicily in 424 BC, warned of the perils, begging for caution, suggesting instead a defensive posture to protect the empire's vital interests. His voice was drowned in the chorus of applause for Alcibiades' silver-tongued promises. Why does this matter now? Consider the modern landscape. The United States, China, and the EU constantly juggle the temptation of expansion, be it in cyber domains, trade routes, or geopolitical influence, against the reality of overstretched supply chains and political backlash. The same dynamics that played out on the marble steps of the Knicks echo in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley and the war rooms of NATO. When a nation or corporation decides to take the leap without listening to seasoned counsel, the fallout can be catastrophic. Did you know that 60% of Fortune 500 companies that made a major acquisition in the past decade later saw a decline in shareholder value? The Sicilian expedition provides a perfect case study, not just because it ended in a naval disaster that sank 150 ships and killed tens of thousands, but because the decision itself, the policy error, was made in a moment of intoxicating confidence. Thucydides records the debate with a clarity that feels as if you are sitting beside the Athenian citizens, hearing the clank of shields and the rustle of the papyrus rolls. Let us now turn to the text itself, to hear the voices that shaped this fateful choice. Core teaching number 1. The seduction of hubris Alcibiades, who had just returned from exile, stood up and said, "We shall make a great expedition, and if the gods favor us, we shall become great." Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 2, 78.2 Decode. Alcibiades framed the expedition not as a calculated risk, but as a destiny ordained by the gods. He appealed to the assembly's pride, promising that success would elevate Athens to a status beyond mortal achievement. Modern example, in 2017, Uber's leadership announced an aggressive global domination strategy, asserting that the world is ready for our ride, and promising a seismic shift in transportation. The rhetoric was similarly steeped in inevitability. downplaying the regulatory and cultural headwinds that later forced the company to retreat from several markets. Actionable principle. When a proposal is couched in inevitability and grandeur, ask yourself whose interests it serves and whether the promised destiny aligns with hard data. Asterisk rhetorical question asterisk if a leader tells you that the gods favor us, are you hearing the strategy or the charisma? Core teaching number 2. The cost of ignoring dissent asterisk quote asterisk Nicias, who had opposed the expedition on his first appearance, answered, "If we go, the price will be heavy. If we do not, we will be hated for the loss of ground." Yet the assembly, driven by a desire for glory, pressed onward. Asterisk Thucydides, Book 2, 84.1 Decode. Nicias warned that the expedition would be expensive, both in money and lives, and that a failure to act could also erode Athens' prestige. The assembly, however, chose the immediate praise of boldness over the long-term caution of an experienced commander. Modern example. In 2008, the British government's decision to launch the large-scale HS2 high-speed rail project ignored the opposition of seasoned transport economists who warned that the projected ridership was overstated and the fiscal burden would balloon. The resulting cost overruns became a political firestorm, echoing Nicias's foresight. Actionable principle. When seasoned experts raise alarms, quantify their concerns and weigh them against the projected upside before committing resources. Core teaching number 3. The illusion of immediate gains asterisk quote asterisk, the people said, "It is not the real loss that concerns us, but the disgrace." Thus they resolved to go, believing that the shame of inaction outweighed any possible defeat. Asterisk Thucydides, Book 2, 88.1 Decode. The assembly equated restraint with disgrace. They believed that a failed expedition would be worse than a successful one that never happened, so they preferred a high-risk gamble to the discomfort of inaction. Modern example. In 2020, several tech firms hurriedly launched a metaverse platform, believing that failing to be first would be a disgrace to shareholders, even though market research indicated limited consumer demand. The platforms launched to lukewarm receptions, draining resources that could have been allocated to profitable ventures. Actionable principle. Distinguish between reputation risk and material risk. Sometimes the best defense of reputation is prudent restraint. Core teaching number 4. Strategic overreach equals vulnerability asterisk quote asterisk. When the expedition set sail, the Athenians discovered that they could not supply their distant forces, and the enemy took advantage of their stretched lines. Asterisk Thucydides, Book 7, 96.1 Decode. The Athenians failed to secure logistical support for a distant campaign. Their army and navy were isolated, making them easy prey for the Syracusan forces and their Spartan allies. Modern example. In 2014, the U.S. military's attempt to maintain a large presence across multiple theaters, Afghanistan, Iraq, and expanding operations in Africa, stretched supply lines and strained equipment maintenance, leading to increased costs and operational fatigue. Actionable principle. Before extending operations, verify that supply chains and support structures are robust enough to sustain the effort. Core teaching number 5. The long shadow of a bad decision asterisk quote asterisk. The loss of Sicily was a disaster not only for the men who fell, but for the city itself. The empire fell into a crisis from which it never recovered. Asterisk Thucydides, Book 8, 107.1 Decode. The defeat didn't just cost lives. It cracked the economic and political foundations of Athens, accelerating its decline. Modern example. The 2008 financial crisis, precipitated by the reckless expansion of mortgage-backed securities, led not only to bankruptcies, but to a lasting erosion of trust in financial institutions, shaping regulation and public sentiment for decades. Actionable principle. Evaluate decisions not just on immediate outcomes, but on their systemic impact on the organization's health. Pattern interrupt asterisk statistic asterisk. The Sicilian expedition cost Athens roughly 1.5 million talents, a sum equivalent to 30% of its annual revenue. No modern corporation can afford to lose a third of its operating budget on a single venture. Modern application: 3 concrete things you can do this week. First, audit one strategic proposal that your team is considering. List every assumption made about market demand, supply chain resilience, and competitive reaction. Then assign a senior expert to challenge each assumption with a counter scenario. This mirrors Nicias's role. By forcing the dissenting voice into the process, you protect against the Alcibiades effect. Second, implement a reputation versus risk matrix for any public-facing decision. Place the potential loss of prestige on one axis and the material cost on the other. If the initiative falls into the quadrant where prestige drives the decision but material loss is high, pause and reevaluate. This tool directly addresses the assembly's fear of disgrace that led them to the Sicilian folly. Third, map your logistical footprint for any new project that extends beyond your core market. Sketch the supply chain from raw material to end user, identify single points of failure, and develop a redundant backup plan before committing capital. This tackles the overreach that doomed the Athenian fleet in Sicily. Pattern interrupt * rhetorical question *. Are you willing to gamble your organization's future on a promise of glory? Or will you let data, not drama, guide you? Closing: the Athenian assembly believed that the gods would bless a bold adventure, that the shame of not acting was greater than any possible defeat. Thucydides recorded that belief, and we have recorded it again, centuries later, to remind those who sit in power that hubris and the lure of immediate glory can mask the true cost of empire. If the Greeks could hear us today, they would see their story reflected in the headlines of every stock market crash, every overstretched military campaign, and every boardroom that chose flash over prudence. The lesson? The most powerful strategy is sometimes to stay the course, to listen to the seasoned voice, to respect the limits of logistics, and to value sustainable reputation over fleeting triumph. The next episode of The War That Killed Athens dives into the aftermath, how the loss at Syracuse rippled through the Peloponnesian War, and how a once invincible navy became a ghost on the horizon. Miss it, and you'll miss the final chapter of a power that thought it could never fall. Remember, history is not a collection of dates, it is a mirror. Look into it, and you'll see the reflection of today's choices.